relative infectiousness of individuals who never have symptoms. And here we have these three references again. Lee et al., which is reference 9, they say they looked at 303 patients and found approximately 100% as infectious. Wow, okay, then 75% seems like a decent estimate, okay. Cha et al., 2020, which was their reference 15, this paper says they looked at 1,701 secondary contacts and found an infection rate of asymptomatic compared to symptomatic individuals of 40 to 140%. Wow, okay, that's asymptomatic individuals are more infectious than symptomatic individuals according to this paper. Better go look at the paper.
Curiouser and curiouser.
Curiouser and curiouser, yes. And then the third reference that this Johansson et al. Paper looks at is McAvoy et al., which is actually a modeling paper itself. Actually, it's a review paper that tries to do some modeling, and they found a mere 40 to 70%. And from those three numbers, these authors concluded 75% is about right. So, well, let's see if any of those numbers hold, right? Let's see. What we have in, there we go. Nope, hold on a sec. Thank you. In Lee et al., what they did was they looked at 303 actual patients in a health center in South Korea. Cool. It's empirical. This paper finds compellingly that viral load in asymptomatic patients is similar to that in symptomatic patients. Okay, and this is not the only paper actually to have found that viral load is similar in asymptomatic patients and symptomatic patients. But guess what? Viral load is not the same thing as infectiousness or transmissibility. It's just not. It's not the same thing. And the authors of this paper, Lee et al., which are cited by Johansson et al. To support their ridiculous claim that 100%, so this Lee et al. Paper, Johansson claims 100% as infectious for asymptomatic versus symptomatic patients, say, quote, although the high viral load we observed in asymptomatic patients raises a distinct possibility of a risk for transmission, our study was not designed to determine this. Mm-hmm. And under the limitations of their own work, they say, quote, we did not determine the role that molecular viral shedding played in transmission from asymptomatic patients. So takeaway. One of those three references that Johansson et al. Find doesn't provide any evidence of transmissibility, much less 100%. Okay, that's one. We are going to get through these other two pretty quickly. Reference 15, Cha et al. It's an empirical paper tracking cases in Brunei following a super spreader event in Malaysia. So Brunei is a small country. There was a big event, like 16,000 people, religious event in Malaysia. Some number of people came home to Brunei, and a small country with a lot of track and trace possible. And so they were actually able to look at what happened. So another empirical paper that's pretty well done. Actually, I was pretty impressed with this. It's complicated analysis with a lot of variables. And just a reminder that Johansson et al. Find that this paper found 40 to 140% of cases, 40 to 140% of asymptomatic cases, asymptomatic cases are 40 to 140% as infectious as symptomatic cases. That's what Johansson reports about this paper. Well, what does this paper actually find? It finds that in the household setting, which is the only settings where they could find anything statistically significant, symptomatic case patients had 2.7 times the risk of transmitting SARS-CoV-2 as combined asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic patients. Mm. So that's a conservative number. So, again, sorry for all the numbers, but almost 3 times as much infectiousness in symptomatic patients versus the combined asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic and never symptomatic patients. And when you look further into their paper, you find that, of course, the pre-symptomatic patients are more infectious than the never symptomatic patients. And what you don't find is any evidence for 40 to 140%. There's nothing in this paper at all that suggests that asymptomatic patients are more infectious than symptomatic patients. So where are they getting these numbers? Quickly, just the last paper is a review paper, and they're doing it carefully. It's a review only through April 8th, 2020, so it's early in the pandemic, which separates out never symptomatic from pre-symptomatic cases, and it's a careful review. And what they do is they say, we can't tell. There's not enough out there yet. The literature is not rich enough. There's not enough empirical work. We simply can't tell. And they specifically point to variable definitions of what infectiousness means. And they say, okay, so very tentatively, given that we think that maybe asymptomatics have about a 0.4 to 0.7 rate of infectiousness to that of symptomatics, which is exactly the number that that Johansson cite here. And if you could just show my screen one more time, Zach. Once again, we have these 3 papers that the new Johansson paper is basing their numbers on. Lee et al., which was from South Korea, which actually has, in my finding, no evidence at all for transmissibility, and Johansson says approximately 100%. Cha et al., which was the case from Brunei, which, as far as I can tell, shows a third or less asymptomatic patients are a third or less infectious as symptomatic patients, and they say 40 to 140%. On the basis of which I cannot even begin to figure out. And McAvoy et al., which is a highly tentative number, says 40 to 70%. Well, that number they actually got right. You can see that here. They actually got that number. They pulled it directly from the paper, and it's right there. So my conclusion from all of this is that Johansson et al., this new paper, which I expect to start seeing reflected in, in the CDC's guidelines and various health officials' recommended behavioral changes, is that their baseline assumption of 75% infectiousness of asymptomatic relative to symptomatic cases is completely unfounded. And it's possible, but we literally have no evidence for that in the papers that they cite. Given that nothing in the conclusions of this paper should be taken seriously, no policy should be based on it, and we should seriously question any of the work that these guys are doing going forward, because what the hell were they thinking?
So can you go back to the title of the piece?
The main one?
Yeah.
Yeah. SARS-CoV-2 transmission from people without COVID-19 symptoms.
So I think, I'm wondering whether our longtime viewers are having a bit of deja vu, because if you allow yourself to squint at this just right, it is very much like the situation. And unfortunately, I didn't realize until we were on the air what the parallel was, so I don't have the name of the paper. But the paper that declared IDW part of a mechanism of online echo chambering has the very same nature, in which they build a model that creates a shocking impression of a particular hazard. And when you go back and you scrutinize what it is that allowed them to build the model, it is in fact perfectly circular. They built into the model something that allowed them to pull that conclusion out. And in fact, in that case, we had the author of the article on which their assumptions were based saying, hey, you've misused my work. Yep. So it is exactly the same form, which then raises, I think, a very interesting question, which is, why are we facing an epidemic of this style of science?
Who is served by this?
Well,
who is served by this?
I think
either who are they working for, or why are they this confused, or why are they this bad at actually understanding how it is that you build a model that can produce a result that isn't exactly what you fed into that model?
I believe the problem is that we are up against evolution. What's happening here is
That's not very helpful, is it?
It ought to properly frighten us and get us to wake up, because first of all, it's mundane, but realize that positions in academia, for example, are scarce, and therefore competition to get them is ferocious. And the way one gets wins that competition is to publish a lot of stuff, publish stuff that gets cited by others, etc. So in some sense, there's a niche. If you can say things that people will parrot, you're going to do well. And in fact, we see this. If you look at citation rates and how they affect getting hired, it's spectacular, even when you're being cited because you're being mocked. Right? In other words, the fact that your paper is cited a lot by people saying this isn't true doesn't necessarily count against you. So what I'm getting at here is, I don't know why this is showing up in JAMA, right? That's shocking and dangerous, as you point out, because policy is almost certain to be founded on this. But what I suspect is, privately, as we've seen in many different places in the SARS-CoV-2 COVID story, there is a behind-the-scenes consensus about what wise public policy is.
Yes.
And then the facts are rearranged around it to make it look like it is also in your interest as an individual. And so the idea that we have a large amount of transmission from people who never show symptoms, of course, is justifying of a lot of the most draconian measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And
Sure
so
is.
in any case, what that means is that people are looking for evidence that we need to do that. Those who have concluded for whatever reason, responsible or not, public-spirited or not, those who want to impose those restrictions are looking for things that justify it, and this paper is liable to be confirming of their worldview, correct or incorrect. And so in any case, I guess what I'm saying is you've got authors searching for that which the audience demands, and this is, as politics is the opposite of patriotism, giving the audience what it wants is the opposite of science. Science is supposed to tell you what's true irrespective of what you want to hear. This isn't science. It's circular, right? The point is it looks like science. It's dressed up as science, and it is presented in a sciencey place, and that is going to be enough to drive policy.